Good morning. I'm coming to you from Siloam Missionary Baptist Church, located in Rougemont, North Carolina, where the Reverend Wayne Johnson is pastor. I will be bringing you the Sunday school lesson for January 15th, 2023, which is entitled Blessing of Intercession. Lesson text comes from Hebrews chapter 4, verses 14 through chapter 5, verse 10. Related scriptures, Matthew chapter 26, verses 36 through 46, Luke chapter 22, verses 39 through 46, John chapter 11, verses 32 through 45, and chapter 17, verses 9 through 16, and chapter 20, verse 24. My name is Charlotte Timberlake. Thank you for joining me. The scripture lesson text comes from Hebrews chapter 4, starting at verse 14 through chapter 5, ending at verse 10. And it reads, Seeing then that we may have a great high priest that is passed into the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our profession. For we have not an high priest which cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmities, but was in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore come boldly unto the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. For every high priest taken from among men is ordained for men in things pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sin. Who can have compassion on the ignorant and on them that are out of the way, for that he himself also is compassed with infirmity. And by reason hereof he ought, as for the people, so also for himself, to offer for sins. And no man taketh this honor unto himself, but he that is called of God, as was Aaron. So also Christ glorified not himself to be made an high priest, but he that said unto him, Thou art my son, today have I begotten thee. As he saith also in another place, Thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek, who in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplications, with strong crying and tears unto him that was able to save him from death, and was heard in that he feared. Though he were a son, yet learned he obedience by the things which he suffered. And being made perfect, he became the author of eternal salvation unto all them that obey him, called of God, and high priest after the order of Melchizedek. May the Lord add a blessing to the reading of his word. Golden text. Seeing then that we have a great high priest that is passed into the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our profession. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 14. Today's lesson aim. Facts: to understand Jesus' role as the great high priest who can help all believers. Principle: to recognize how Jesus as the great high priest is superior to human high priest. Application: to come to Jesus Christ, the great high priest, in times of difficulty. Introducing the lesson. Understanding the role of an attorney or advocate helps us better understand the role of Jesus Christ as our great high priest who can handle our needs. Christ's high priestly role also shows his sovereignty, for he alone qualifies for this position. Developing the lesson. Number 1. The position of our great high priest. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 14. The book of Hebrews was written to first century believers who came out of Judaism. These believers faced persecution and perhaps wanted to return to their old beliefs, which offered a visible high priest who might in some way be of help to them. The writer of Hebrews urged his readers to hold fast their confession of Christ and not go back, for they already had their great high priest, quote, Jesus, the Son of God, end quote, who had, quote, passed into the heavens, end quote. Though they could not see him, he was in heaven, actively serving as their mediator and advocate. Number 2, the nature of our great high priest. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15. Since Jesus Christ was in heaven, the believers may have wondered how he could really know their needs and help them. The writer of Hebrews responded by saying, quote, we have not an high priest which cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmities, end quote. Here he used a double negative to emphasize the fact that our great high priest does sympathize with our weaknesses. Number 3, the invitation of our great high priest. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 16. Because Jesus, our high priest, is the Son of God, and because he knows our needs, he invites us to, quote, come boldly unto the throne of grace that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need, end quote. When we come, we can be sure he will give us the help we need. The role of Jesus Christ as our sinless great high priest demonstrates his sovereignty and superiority over all other priests. Number 4, the qualifications of our great high priest. Hebrews chapter 5, verses 1 through 10. Lest some people wonder about Jesus' qualifications as a high priest, the writer set forth his credentials. First, he was qualified by appointment. Jesus Christ was appointed by God the Father. Second, he was qualified by training. Christ presented his offerings of prayers and petitions with loud cries and tears. He also learned obedience from the things he suffered. The result is that he was made perfect or complete and thus became the source of eternal salvation for all who trust in him. I would now go over the questions in the back of the lesson. Question number 1. Why is it essential that our great high priest be both human and divine? The answer, this great high priest is both human and divine. Quote, Jesus, the Son of God, end quote. His humanity is essential to his identification with those he is representing. Chapter 2, verse 17. And his deity is essential for him to exercise his power and impute his righteousness for their forgiveness. Question number 2. How did Jesus' temptations compare with those we face? The answer, Jesus can identify with us in our weaknesses because in every way he was tempted just as we are yet remained without sin. Although God cannot be tempted by evil, James chapter 1 verse 13, Jesus could be tempted because he also is human. The fact that he was tempted in every respect does not mean he experienced every single temptation of every person, but that he faced every kind of temptation. Solicitation to evil dogged him his whole life, not just at the time of Satan's recorded temptations. Question number 3. How can we as sinners have access to God's throne of grace? The answer, because our high priest can so completely identify with us, we are urged to, quote, come boldly unto the throne of grace, end quote. Quote, come, end quote, speaks concisely of moving into close proximity. This is an important theme of this book, open access to God. Cross-reference chapter 7, verse 19 and verse 25, and chapter 10, verses 19 through 22. Christ's priestly work opens the way to God's presence. We are encouraged to follow him there boldly with freedom to commune with God. Number 4. What course did a priest have to follow in dealing with human weaknesses? The answer: the high priest had to steer a middle course in dealing with human weakness, being neither too lenient nor too harsh. He could do this because he saw the same weaknesses in himself. Question number 5. How does Jesus' identification with humans differ from that of purely human priests? The answer: though Jesus too identified with humans in their weakness, cross-reference Hebrews chapter 2, verses 17 through 18, and chapter 4, verse 15, his weakness did not entail moral frailty. He did not sin and therefore did not have to offer a sacrifice for himself, a fact that the author emphasized later, chapter 7, verses 26 through 28. In fact, Jesus would be able to give his own body and blood as an atonement for the sins of others, chapter 9, verse 12, and chapter 10, verse 10. Question number 6. From what ancestry did Jewish priests have to come? Why? The answer: a high priest had to be called by God, just as Aaron was. This divine appointment was not only a personal one, but also included Aaron's descendants. Exodus chapter 28, verse 1, and 1 Chronicles chapter 23, verse 13. Having been appointed by God, Jewish high priests were expected to carry out his revealed will. Deviation was bound to bring judgment. Cross-reference 1 Samuel chapter 2, verses 27 through 36. Question number 7. Did Jesus seek out the high priestly office? Explain. The answer: though he was the Messiah and the Son of God, Jesus did not appropriate to himself the position of high priest. He awaited the appointment of his Father. Question number 8. How does Christ's priesthood differ from that of Jewish priests? The answer: this quotation tells us two characteristics of Christ's priesthood. First, it is forever. It is eternal because the priest himself is eternal, never to be succeeded. Hebrews chapter 7, verse 28. Second, it is based on the order of Melchizedek. The idea of an, quote, order, end quote, is best understood as a precedent or pattern, for Melchizedek never established an order of priests. A king priest of Abraham's day, Genesis chapter 14, he was one of a kind and thus a fitting picture of Christ. Question number 9. How did Christ identify with human beings? The answer: the author of Hebrews preferred at this point to examine the other major qualification of our high priest, his identification with humans in their suffering. And question number 10. In what sense did Christ learn obedience? The answer: thus, Jesus' human struggles completed his preparation for the high priesthood. Quote, though he were a son, yet learned he obedience by the things which he suffered, end quote. Hebrews chapter 5, verse 8. His sonship may lead us to assume that he would not have to suffer, but suffering enabled him to learn in human experience what it meant to obey God. Cross-reference Matthew chapter 26, verse 39 and verse 42. Philippians chapter 2, verses 6 through 8. Here are the practical points. Number 1, we know our high priest can enter God's holy presence, for he is God. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 14. Number 2, Our high priest is able to relate to us because he has been tempted as we have. Verse 15. Number 3. Because of our high priest, we can be confident that God will give us mercy and grace. Verse 16. Number 4. All other high priests in history have had to offer sacrifices for their own sins. Chapter 5, verses 1 through 3. Number 5. Jesus was appointed by God to be our high priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. Verses 4 through 6. Number 6. Jesus was heard because of his reverence and obedience to the Father. Verses 7 through 10. In summary, because Jesus Christ is our great high priest, we can come boldly before God's throne. He will not turn us away. For us, his throne is not a throne of judgment and condemnation. Cross-reference Romans chapter 8, verse 1, Revelations chapter 20, verse 11, but rather a place to find grace, mercy, and help. This will conclude the lesson for this morning. Thank you for listening. There's nothing that can keep you from the blessings of God.